Good evening and welcome everyone to another vBrownBags. Tonight we are joined again by Dwayne McDaniel. Hey Dwayne, thank you for joining.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for coming back. So Dwayne has joined us before talking about Git and everything under the hood of Git with a talk he gave called Demystifying Git. It was really great. It goes into, the details of the Git folder, a little bit of background on the history of Git, all the new features of Git, and some of the lesser known features that if you add them to your Git workflow, it probably really help you out. So happy to have Dwayne back. Tonight we're going to be he's going to be talking to us about what Git metrics can tell us about your team, not us, what Git metrics can tell you about your team. Yeah, so Dwayne has been working as a DevRel professional since 2016. He's been involved with the wider tech community even before then. Dwayne's currently still in Chicago, and I don't know, are you still doing improv, or are you?
Yeah, about the same amount I was before, but yeah, I'm still here. I was at the theater last night, the Annoyance last night, watching some awesome improv. Yeah, and I was on stage on Sunday, so yeah, and seeing a lot of rock and roll these days. It's really the summer in Chicago is pretty awesome for a lot of reasons, but rock and roll is where it's at.
Yeah, I have to get to Chicago. I've heard many great things about it. A colleague of mine showed me, I forgot the name of it. It's this national park right on the water, but it just looked beautiful. And but for that and many other reasons, I need to get to Chicago. But a little bit before we get started, join us in on the conversation. I'll be looking at Twitter all night. I'll also be watching the chat feed throughout the show. And if you have any questions for Dwayne, put it in the chat, put it on Twitter. And with the Twitter hashtag @vBrownBag or hashtag vBrownBag, and I'll make sure to get those answered. You can follow Dwayne McDaniel @McDwayne on Twitter. You can follow me at Cloud Osmotic. And with that, let's get started. So Dwayne, the ball is yours, and thank you again.
I would do that awkward transition. I think I have to stop sharing your screen before I can take over.
Oh. Yes, there we go.
Alrighty, now I'm gonna share my screen. Yeah, great thing there where it inverts a little bit, or infinite. Anyway, hey everybody, I'm Dwayne. Very excited to be back here for vBrownBag. Very awesome that I got invited back. So I really had a good time last time, and a really good conversation. It's a really awesome community, and happy to be supported. So as I think this is everything that was said about me, follow me on Twitter out there. If you have any questions about anything, hit me up, and I'm happy to. I'll talk about just about anything out there. So these days I work for a company called Git Guardian. Git Guardian is a code security platform. The thing that they are the most known for is secrets detection. They have a public monitoring tool that is completely free to use for open source and for individual developers, and it detects secrets. Secrets being those things like passwords and API keys and certificates and all of the other crazy stuff that we need to make all of the DevOps infrastructure work. They also make internal monitoring. So if you have an app that is completely private, still make sure that, hey, we're not leaking our secrets anywhere. And there is a new thing. This just went up in the last few weeks, Labs by Git Guardian. Git Guardian makes a bunch of things, but they have projects that the Good Samaritan project, where they're taking a look at all the repos they can see out on the internet, specifically on GitLab or GitHub, and figuring out, hey, our secrets exposed there. GG Shield for Docker, Git Guardian Shield for Docker. If you're running Docker, there's a lot of ways you can leak secrets there, and that's a awesome project. It's a CLI that will help you figure out pretty quickly, did we do Docker security right? Has my code leaked? If you're wondering if someone's got your code out there, this is a really easy, quick, and free way to figure that out, looking at the signatures of your Git repos. And GG Canary, which is the newest thing that Git Guardians rolled out. Canaries are fake tokens that if someone tries to use it, it sends off alarms. So a quick way to see, hey, is someone actually trying to get into my system? Set up some canaries and wait and find out. It's my favorite story, and I'm fairly new here, but one of my favorite stories is someone put out a canary and within 4 hours, the first attempt, and then it was multiple attempts after that. So it's a dangerous world out there. We got your back. Check out Git Guardian, but I'm not really here to talk about that. I'm happy to talk about anything else. And I have a lot of slides on this deck, and I used this exact same slide before. I can't teach you everything you could possibly need to know about Git metrics and how to map that to your DevOps organization. Hopefully, I'll point you in the right direction today, give you some more resources and some food for thought. If you disagree with me on some things, that's all right. These are my opinions based on the data that I have seen and all the reading and research I have done. You might come to slightly different conclusions, but I think we'll have a good conversation and be on the right path. So why am I talking about this particular issue? Working with Git and DevOps for as long as I have found that a lot of people just, we're going to run it and hopefully it runs well. And they're not measuring everything they can be measuring to improve it. As Lord Kelvin said, if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. Some things are really easy to measure, and we measure those really well. That's New Relic over there on the left, one of their examples from their docs. But you can get all sorts of server stats at a moment's notice, uptime, disk capacity, all the great stuff. If I ask 100 developers, what's the most important server stat, you'd get 100 different awesome answers. When it comes to measuring some other things, now it starts getting a little trickier. It's like, what do we measure to make sure our developers are doing their job right? Is the number of lines of code an hour? Well, theoretically, they'd write more elegant code, so that we can't do that. That they showed up to their desk every day. Some developers work in spurts, and you don't see them for 2 weeks at a time, and then they don't leave the office for a month. How many bagels do they eat? Is that a really important number? Not really. When we start talking about DevOps, there are tons and tons of things to measure, because DevOps is not one thing. It's the practice of putting all of the pieces together to develop and deploy and operate our code and our systems out there. So these are some possible things we can measure. Do they tell us anything? Maybe. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. The problem, though, isn't that we don't have enough data. We have a lot more data right now, and more data is being produced every day than we've ever produced in the history of humanity. It's insane how much data is out there. We'll share the slides, and there's a link to this article, and it's kind of mind-blowing how much data we've created. I think it was 2008 was the year we crossed over, where we hit a point where we were creating more data a day than we had created from the entire history of humanity up to that point. And we've been multiplying ever since. So it's kind of nuts. And we have all these great projects where we're going to use business intelligence to get all this data and use it. And we built these things called data lakes. I don't know about you, but I grew up by Lake Erie, and Lake Erie is kind of terrifying because you cannot see more than like a foot below the water. You don't know what's down there. Catfish the size of cars. Who knows what's in your data lakes? Maybe security stuff that shouldn't be in there. Who's accessing these data lakes? What lurks beneath? Well, luckily, Google had the same problem, and Google threw a lot of time and money behind this and said, we should build something that figures out for our DevOps organizations, what's the right data? What's the right thing to measure? So they built this thing called DORA, DevOps Research and Assessment. If you get nothing else out of this talk, if you have not read this book yet, Accelerate by Nicole Ferguson, Jez Humble, and Gene Kim, go buy this and read it a couple times. This is kind of the Bible for how DevOps should function now and what we should be measuring. So if you've read this already and you already have a strong set of opinions, maybe this talk isn't you're going to get a lot out of this talk. Maybe you'll disagree with me on some things. If you're brand new to this, well, that's why I've written this talk. Oversimplified, maybe to the point of not usefulness, but organizations that do DevOps poorly struggle, which results in employee burnout and high turnover, which then has a cascading effect, the vicious cycle that since there's so much burnout, there's so much turnover, they never get their handle on actually fixing the problems. Meanwhile, organizations that do it right very much align their business benefits and mission with their DevOps mission, and everybody's happy. Literally everybody's happy. That's the outcome. And we call those performers elite performers. Now, of course, not everybody's super ecstatic every day of their lives, but overall, you get happier employees, happier places to work. DORA, again, oversimplified, says these are the 4 things that matter, these 4 metrics. Before we go and dig into those, though, word of caution, the results, our good metrics are a result of solving an underlying issue. They are not we have these great metrics, awesome, we can go off and do other things now. It takes a lot of dedication and a lot of work to get to good metrics, and it should be a result of that process, not, hey, we juked the stats, as they said on The Wire, and now suddenly, hey, everybody should be happy because this number technically went up. So don't go chasing these as numbers. Think of these as, these are indicators of how all the rest of your processes are going together. Again, oversimplifying what it took a DORA team an entire book to tell you. But anyway, here's the 4 DORA metrics in very simple terms. Deployment frequency. How fast do you get stuff to production? How often is code deployed? How often is it released to end users? The more automation you have, the closer you get to that elite performer status. Mean lead time for changes. How long does it take to get a commit from your developer's laptop to production? This is slightly different than deployment frequency. This is measuring how often you do it. This is how fast you do it. It's the health metric for cycle time. And the big metric that it actually highlights is how can you handle unexpected influxes of requests. If it takes you 3 months to get something to production, an emergency is not going to go well. However, it takes you 20 minutes to get, oh, we got this code change, cool. It takes 20 minutes from beginning to end. Oh, wow, we got an emergency today. An extra 20 minutes isn't going to hurt anybody. You can think of this as velocity. If there's one word to sum up lead time for changes. Mean time for recovery, stuff goes wrong. It happens to everybody. How long does it take you to come back from an unplanned outage? This is stability. This is the stability of your system in a nutshell. If it takes you days unless like there's a catastrophic power outage on the entire East Coast and it took out AWS and S3 buckets, unless like something outside of your control happened, if you can come back very quickly, that's a very good sign. Oops, we've deployed something we shouldn't have. Let's roll back. That took minutes. You're probably in the elite performer category already. You're probably doing it right. Change failure rate. When you make changes, how often do you need to roll those things back? It's related to mean time to recover, but this is one that really speaks to the robustness of your entire DevOps practice. Really, more time you spend fixing things, the less time you have to delight your customers, is the basic underlying theory here. The less, everybody's going to mess up though. So this assumes that eventually you are going to deploy something you shouldn't have, and you do need to roll it back. If it happens every deployment, something's wrong. Happens once in a while, don't worry about it. Don't sweat it. They broke this down into really awesome charts. And if you get the audio book like I did, they include all the PDFs with that. And you can go study this all day. Like I say, buy the book. And I'm not going to read the book to you. Because at this point, you probably came in here and said, well, wait a minute, you're talking about Git metrics, and now you're explaining DORA metrics to me. Wait, what? What's going on? Don't worry. That's what the rest of this talk is. That's what the rest of the time we're going to spend together. The next 30 minutes or so. 25, 30 minutes or so. How do we map our Git metrics to those DORA metrics? So before we can really do that and do a one-to-one mapping, let's talk quickly about what I mean by what Git metrics can tell you about your team. Let's just break it down. Git is a version control system. I'm not going to explain how it works in depth, but it gives you versions of your code at any snapshot you want to take. We call those snapshots commits. We can take those commits and ship them all over the place. And it has become the underlying mechanism for how DevOps functions. Because of that, no matter what your DevOps infrastructure looks like, Git is at the heart. It's that beating heart that we can start looking at numbers that you already have access to, probably. What Git metrics tell you about your team? Well, this is where the mapping actually starts. So if it's in blue, that is the DORA metric. If it's black, that is the Git metric. That's how I color coded these. So cycle time. This is a function of mean lead time for changes. So how much time does the team spend from the start of the work until it gets deployed and available to the end user? It's the measurement of the commit making it to production, which is a subset over the overarching metric of lead mean time for changes. But that cycle time should be short. If it's very long, if you know that the time it takes for a deployment to happen is longer than you want it to be, well, that's an area you probably need to improve on. Coding time, slightly different than cycle time. It's a subset of cycle time. But from the time the ticket's picked up until that push happens, how long did that take? And on the surface, that might seem a little bit like, but that could be any number. It shouldn't be any number. It should be, in general, a short chunk. Whether you're doing Scrum or Kanban, if it ranges all over the map, that points as an underlying problem within your organization's request system. How often are you making giant requests that are going to take a month versus tiny requests that are going to take 2 minutes? Why is it all over the map? Why is this not a fairly consistent? Like, I understand how long it takes a developer to do something. Why is that gotten lost in the process? I'm not pointing fingers and saying everybody's got this right or wrong. Just this is something we can start looking at for the numbers we have access to when we start looking at our GitHub metrics. Pull request time until review. This is the time from the code being submitted until the QA testing team can get to it. This is a subset of deployment frequency. If it has to sit there behind a row of other requests that have already been sent back, that's a bad sign. If it is, oh, we have the automated system and there's a slight queue of how often we can look at the results and do the final human approval process, that's probably a really good thing. One of my old colleagues, Andrew Taylor, used to say, one of the jobs of automation is to put all of the work onto the machines, and then I, as a human, just need to review the results. I don't have to actually go manually do any of the things. And this is a very good indicator of, are you doing automation correctly? The more you can shift it over to the left and have developers do testing early and often and relieve the QA team so they are really just dealing with like extreme cases and scale cases that you can't test locally, the better. Actual review time for PRs. This is a fun one that's directly related to coding time and cycle time. Yeah, PR review time. If it takes you forever to go through a PR line by line and there's 40 files involved and 1,000 lines of code, there's probably not something good at, there probably wasn't agreement early on what the scope of that request should have been. There wasn't communication of this or what our normal cycles look like. This is what our sprints look like. We need to break our requests down. And there wasn't enough communication of like, yeah, we can get that done, but it's going to take us 4 sprints. Like, no, we just need to do it and review it all at once. The problem is this one of the problems, there's many problems here, but one of the problems is the PR review time is very dependent on what else is in their queue. If PRs take forever, that queue just keeps getting longer and longer and longer. Rate of code rejection for PRs. This is very much deployment frequency issue, and it sounds like on the surface it might be change failure. But this isn't failure in production. This is failure before it makes it to production. This is failed tests. This is QA time and testing time, sending it back and forth and sending that loop. So instead of having the feedback loop of end users being like, I love this feature, I hate this feature, it would be great if feature did X. It is, this code don't work. It does now, but it doesn't work in this case. Oh, you didn't account for this security issue. If we can categorize and identify the reasons for rejected PRs, you can start addressing like the overall, like what is actually causing this? Is it just one bad programmer? I hate to say it, but there's an easy fix for that. You get a different programmer. If it is, we poorly defined what we wanted to happen, you can probably address that programmatically, or not programmatically, with process-wise. Project branch lifetime. There's a lot of ways you can run a Git branching strategy. What DORA uncovered, and I didn't agree with it first. I had to read the book a couple times and talk to a bunch of engineers about this. The shorter a branch lives, the healthier your overall DevOps pipeline is. It's a direct correlation. People like Google and Twilio and very large successful companies typically go with trunk-based development.
Mm-hmm.
The only exception to this is open source. Open source, given the nature of it, you can't do trunk-based. I mean, you theoretically could if it's small enough of a team, but if you think of like the Drupal project, there's thousands of developers all over the world working on things. Linux project, tens of thousands of developers adding code to it. There's no way you could do trunk. And some branches just live forever. And having multiple branches in your Git branch strategy, prod, dev, test, whatever you want to call them, that are permanent branches, that's a different thing than our feature branches. It took us 6 months to get this feature branch finally merged and we could archive it or delete that branch. That's probably not a good sign. Another caveat that they were quick to point out in the Accelerate book is local branches don't really factor into this. We're talking about shared branches. If you are working on something on the side, especially in open source, and that branch is just where you do the work for that locally, probably nothing wrong with that. That doesn't really factor into our DevOps metrics. That's a local coding thing. Now, it can start affecting our coding times if you get lost in your Git branches. Originally, my point here was back when I was working with Git Kraken, use tools that help you understand your friggin' branches, like visualize them, understand them a little bit better. Don't get lost in just a bunch of text, lines of text, and have to map in your head how they all go together. And
so, can I ask a question?
Sure.
Sorry, I was really trying hard to wait because this is all great information, but I have questions roiling in the back of my head, and maybe you'll be addressing these. But so all of these things, right? Measuring time for branch lifetime, measuring failure. So, which I guess the time-based metrics is, a lot of these are geared towards time-based metrics. How fast do we get code out there? How fast does a QA team review PRs? How fast does a PR get reviewed? Mm-hmm. Or how fast does a QA team get to looking at what's come through, and how fast does a PR get through? And then there's the how often do you fail? How things like that. Are these metrics emitted that we can like? So you showed, I think you showed Datadog earlier, or some
New Relic, yeah.
New Relic, some collection tool, right? Like, is there a way to get these metrics collected?
That is a great question, and give me a couple slides to get there.
Okay.
Because I'm almost there. I'm almost there, I promise you. But so the last metric that Git metric you have full access to locally is commits, just the raw number of commits. This again isn't counting how many commits did you squash locally. If you as a local developer on your local machine or your local cloud dev environment, your specific cloud dev environment, it took you 50 tries to get the commit right, fine, that's fine. But if there are 50 commits in your history because it took you 50 tries to 50 pushes to get there, something probably ain't right. And it also works as the base, since the base of is the base metric, since the base of Git, base unit of Git, and that's why I started by defining Git as a set of snapshots. Those number of commits, that is the base number we can build all of our other Git metrics off of. Now, the thing that is obvious, and I think one of the things your question was leading to, is like, but what about those other ones? Mean time to recover, change failure rate. How do we get at those numbers? I wish there was a better answer. I don't know what recovery means for your organization. Git doesn't know that. Git knows commits. Git knows timestamps. Git knows who wrote the thing. Git knows how many commits there are. Git knows your history. It can't tell you what failure means. It can't tell you what recovery means. Frequency and changes, yes, easy enough. Failure, what does that mean exactly? Is the whole system down? Is one piece broken?
Yeah, and seems like it's kind of like a balancing act, right? Because your change failure rate could be high, and maybe that means your PR and review process is too loose, or maybe your change failure rate is very low, but then your mean lead time for changes is super high because it takes forever. You have great code coverage and review, but it just takes it just takes so long to get the changes out. So I can see those kind of being like dualistic there.
Yeah,
a little bit.
And this is a problem, and that's literally the talking point of this slide. This is the holy grail right now for DevOps tooling. Everybody's chasing this and have been for a few years. The companies that are doing it really well are like GitLab and Haystack and LinearB. Haystack, LinearB, Pluralsight. These are not cheap solutions. They are expensive tools that help you gather all of these metrics in one place and give you those dashboard views. GitLab, one of the reasons I love GitLab is they do everything in the open. You can go watch engineering meetings on YouTube. That's how they distribute them around the world. That's how I learned a lot about, I think I linked to one of their YouTube channels later, I think. Maybe I don't. But you can just go look up GitLab, DORA, and meeting in Google, and you will find YouTube videos of them talking about this problem. They have full access to those first two because they're Git-based tools. GitKraken was building something. I'm not sure if it's public yet or not by the time this airs, but they're working on things because, well, they're Git tools that start pointing to like, how do we get to those Git metrics that underlie those things? And that's really where I was involved in the conversation and really my point of view when I wrote this deck. I wrote this talk. I mean, those metrics, because they're Git, are pretty easy to map out. And it's something you can do on your own, but tools are there to help you. It's that qualitative, well, what do we mean by recovery? What do we mean? Like, how do you, one of the problems that GitLab talked about in a meeting was assuming Git branch names mapped to specific things. And they even said, like, it's hilarious because we're assuming this and that's not how we do it internally. Someone's going to ask me for that exact link. It would take me a while to dig it back out, but it's a meeting from like 2000 or 2001 when they say that. It's a hard problem. DORA, actually, believe it or not, not completely, but mostly relies on survey data. Survey data can tell you those facts. What's your average time to recover, or mean time to recover? What's your change failure rate? Half of the book of Accelerate is defending the methodology. Not even kidding. It's only about half the book explains what I explained here. It goes into a little more detail. Half the book is just explaining, like, you can trust survey data in these specific circumstances. So that's the last piece of who do you ask? Who do you have this conversation with? What do you do with this? Like, great, I'm a developer or I run a team and I have Git metrics and I know we have a DevOps organization. What do I do now? Start with just the people working around you. Is everybody using Git the same way? Hey, why is one person pushing a bunch of PRs and then the person sitting beside them doesn't? Are we all on the same page as far as the release process? Does everyone know how this works? When you onboard a new person, is this dramatically impacting all of your numbers? If it is, well, you have some work to do. I'm not saying there's a right or a wrong 100%, but onboarding someone shouldn't drastically spike your change failure rate. Your DevOps team, say you and your coding team, your immediate team working around you. I'm assuming the person listening to this is a developer or leading the dev team. You already might be on this team, the DevOps team. And I know DevOps incorporates everything. I get it. But there's also people that are responsible for, your testing suite being available and connected to your other parts of your pipeline. So the whole team holistically that manages DevOps, is someone actually responsible for chasing these numbers down? Like I said, Lord Kelvin quote, if you don't measure it, you can't improve it. Who's measuring it? If you're suddenly thinking like, who is responsible for this on my company? Maybe it's time to start having this conversation. Maybe it's time to buy them copies of Accelerate and start saying, maybe we should start moving toward a worldview where we're trying to get these metrics to go up and to the right. How much automation do you have in place? If you already have everything automated, then, well, maybe it's just time to fine tune some stuff. Or maybe you're an elite performer already. And this is, I don't know why you're listening to my talk. Your QA team, it's a subset of DevOps, but they are dedicated teams. And your support team, I would highly encourage everyone to go talk to your actual support teams, like the customer support teams. They are the front lines. They know what breaks. They know, this is speaks to the qualitative data versus quantitative data. When something technically works, but it doesn't do as expected, is that a failure? If your support team is slammed with requests all of a sudden, that's a failure. No matter if it's just re-education, if it's something else is needed, that speaks to, oh yeah, okay, we have failed in delighting our customer. Because at the end of the day, that's what you're supposed to be doing, is delighting your customers. Are they responsible for all the testing automation? If so, why? You need to shift left and start disseminating their knowledge. Like, all right, this is how you do unit testing. This is how we're going to test it. So here's the testing tools. Why don't you just test it before you submit the PR? Have those conversations. Marketing and sales team. Yeah, they actually do matter here. Who's making the requests that you're taking these uncontrolled amounts of time to deploy? Ultimately, this is the team making those requests. Because we all, if you worked in sales, then you know that you're the most important person in the whole company. If you're outside of sales, you know that every salesperson thinks that they're the most important person in the whole company and that their customer is the only one that matters. So when their biggest customer, their deal of the quarter, has these crazy demands, now it's on your shoulders. What do they think the truth is here? How do they communicate with you? Is there a clear? It's a question I've asked every company I've ever interviewed with in my life. Like, what's the actual feedback communication system look like between your sales team and your engineering team? And the ones that stare at me blankly and say, that's a good question, I don't talk to. That's a true fact. If they say, oh, well, we have these systems in place, I'm not going to go into any specifics on it, but if there's a clear communication channel there and like, okay, this goes through product and then product communicates to engineering, and here's the actual system, and I can show you the Asana board or the Jira cards for how that works. That's an awesome sign. They probably don't use version control, so you can't really get metrics from them. But it's important for them to understand that that's the metrics you're going off of, and that how your metrics are affected by their requests. But ultimately, the people that pay the bills, the people that cut the checks, they need to be bought into all this. How do you interface with them? If you don't at all, that's probably not a good sign. Is it just one-way communication? If there is, they're probably what they consider failure, what you consider failure, probably slightly different things. Finding that common ground of, well, it works. If you're saying that and they're very unhappy, it's going to be a bad day. And if they're saying it works and it doesn't, that's going to be a bad day in a completely different way.
Yeah, it's the old, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Well,
What's broke mean?
It's yeah, exactly. One thing I find very interesting too about this, and I enjoy that you're going down this road, is that how big do you think that there's been? So originally DevOps, or not, I shouldn't say originally, but a big component of DevOps is that not just it's the continuous feedback, emphasis on feedback and communication loop. Do you think it's gotten a little, through the years, it's gotten focused more on the pipeline and engineering aspect of it, and we almost need like another two arms going up and down to talk about the feedback metrics and also feedback communication process part? Because I feel like people focus solely on the code, deploy, release, review, and then that, but we really this is so important, right? It's all about communication, feedback processes. Like how do you integrate that outside of just the technical bits and bytes of it, right?
I think that is where your Scrum masters and your Agile leads come in, personally, and I 100% agree with you. It's an old adage, and I'm going to butcher it, but if something can be turned into a product, it will be turned into a product. And that's really what happened with DevOps. I mean, continuous integration was a thought process that Martin Fowler wrote down. It says this is how we go from not communicating and having all these problems to automation and not having all these problems. And that got turned into, well, just buy my product and it does this. Right. And the people that are the stalwarts of, hey, this is how this should go, and let's keep on the guardrails and just remember it is a communication. Those people have Scrum Master titles. Those people have, are leading Agile teams. Investing in those people, if the company is like, well, no, it'll figure itself out, bad sign, red flag. If it is, no, this person's in charge of making sure that we don't have a long lag time between a request getting made and actually getting production, and their job's on the line if that starts going all over the map. That is the people person, the people ops in the core of DevOps. Right. But you're absolutely right. We've tried to think of DevOps as a set of tools versus a set of beliefs and processes. And yeah, I think I don't know if we need to change that picture at all, because that picture is already pretty complex. But that's what that picture is supposed to be representing, is the communication feedback loop. One of my favorite definitions of DevOps ever, Kelly Albright from Last Call Media. I don't know if he's still there, but like DevOps is the continual feedback loop of, did it work? How do we make it better? I'm paraphrasing him heavily, but that's what DevOps should be all about, not the automation tooling, because it's just a tool.
Right.
So let me wrap up real quick, and then we'll get to all the other questions. So what do you do with all this information? Like, it's great that I presented all this stuff. You go read Accelerate. It's going to give you a lot more information about how to make surveys happen and whatnot. But I think there's some stuff everyone could do. Do you have access to this Git data? Everybody's using Git, but do you actually have access to how many commits are in your average deployment? How long does branches live? That data is all there, but can you get to it? If it's not your job, go have the conversation with someone to make sure someone's got it. Are there obstacles where, you know, there's too many things going on and we don't have that line of sight? That's a bad indicator. Go get that line of sight. And if you go to people and like, well, we got to get this, like, let's unblock this and get this data to figure out where we are in the map, and they push back and say, no, ain't worth it, that's a bad sign. If they say, well, I don't know how to get that data actually, but you know what, we should be getting that data. How do we get that data? And you go talk to your BI people, your business intelligence people, and it starts clearing out and clearing the way, and you start like, okay, I can get that data. You're probably in a good org and you might already be at the elite side of it, but you don't know until you measure. To your point, communication is the key component here. If you're in Jira, but the people originating your requests are in Asana, how are those things getting translated? It's not one-to-one. How is it affecting your Git repos? I guarantee you it is somehow in some way, shape, or form, but how is your communication strategy working? Is everyone on the same page? This is especially true when you're talking to teams that customer facing, like marketing, sales, customer support, customer success, or whatever you want to call them these days. Are you working around the systems you have in place that were put in for good reasons? We all buy and put in systems because they say on the box they're going to do awesome things for us, and then we end up going around it because that's too slow. There was a serious problem I faced in a couple organizations I worked in, won't name any names, where there's an official ticketing system and then the conversations on Slack that go around the ticketing system so we can get things done. That problem in and of itself is a whole talk. Right. That last one, it actually comes from a commercial, but I'll credit Scott Crawford for drilling into my head. Scott Crawford was VP of sales at Pantheon for a couple of years. Just because you yell something louder doesn't make it any clearer. There's a old commercial where like someone yells "cement waffle frog helmet" or something like that. Can't remember the exact phrase. Couldn't find it either. I spent some time looking, and it was just them thinking they were communicating because they were extremely loud. And it might have been a Holiday Inn commercial. I don't remember, but just being mad and just yelling to get your own way doesn't fix a dang thing if you have other problems. So just keep that in the back of your head.
I'm going to find that source, and if I'm ever in a meeting where I don't understand what somebody's saying, I'm going to start shouting that.
Well, the last big is set yourself up for success here. You got to have top-down and bottom-up buy-in. If it's just you and your team implementing your awesome plan, your organization's not going to benefit. Your team might, and there's probably nothing wrong, and everything's got to start somewhere. And you can show results of my team improved all of these awesome metrics because we started doing things this way, and here's the results to prove it. Oh, I realized that I have messed this slide up, and I did not actually fix the things on the side. Sorry about that. I just rebuilt these slides right before this talk. But the important thing here, and I'm not going to go dig out the correct one. Important thing here is that if everyone is talking past each other. And the people at the top are like, well, we do it our way, and these are the numbers that are important to us. And the people at the bottom, no matter how you define top or bottom here, I'm not saying you could put your key stakeholders at the bottom in this paradigm. If the people outside of your team, I should say, that may be a better way to put it, outside of your team are in disagreement on what metrics even matter and how we're getting at them and why we should go chase them, then you're not going to see any improvement in the org. And then you're going to still have that burnout, and it's going to be a bad place to work. So wrap it up real quick, and then we'll go on to questions, wrap up the hour. Metrics are important. We all have access to a lot of data, even though you might not have access to the right data. You still have access to some data, somewhere to even start from. Your own commit history, if nothing else. Knowing what to measure is important as measuring itself. That's where things like Google's DORA and Accelerate are really going to come in handy to point you in the right direction of like, here's why this stuff matters, and ultimately how you identify top performers. If you chase metrics in isolation just to chase a metric, it's bad. You want the overall results. DORA gives you 4 overarching things, but it's up to you to like, how do our internal numbers map to these things? There's other books, there's other articles, there's a lot of information out there about how people are trying. It's as much art as it is science, I believe, at this point. That's my opinion saying that. But communication is the crucial point in making all of this work. You can go buy more tools to help you do this, but unless you have that agreement about how you're going to communicate and work together after you've bought that tool, you might as well not buy the tool. If you buy yet another awesome dashboard and you're the only one looking at it and no one has any actionable items off of you looking at it, you're not going to do well. Let's never forget, well, first, Randy Savage is one of the coolest people I've ever lived. But 2, also elite performers communicate very effectively across the entire org. When one person says something a certain way, everyone else in the organization understands exactly what they mean. Most of the time. Everybody understands what they're doing very deeply. They understand that their business mission very much should line up with their individual developer mission, should line up with the individual mission of QA, should line up with the individual mission of customer support. It all happens together to make a healthy organization. And everybody's bought in on the same goal, the same vision of like, this is how DevOps works. Again, there are tons of resources. These are just the first like 6 I wrote down. Hundreds more. If you Google Google Accelerate, that's weird to say, Google Accelerate or Google DORA or DORA metrics, you will find page after page after page of article. There's a really good breakdown. I don't even have it on here. There it is. Yeah, I do have. Linear B did a really good job of breaking down Git metrics in and of themselves. It's where I draw some of what I've done. And there are other great, awesome, simplified breakdowns of Accelerate outside the book, but the book's awesome. And it's got Martin Fowler as the wrote the intro, so you can't go wrong. So I'm Dwayne, live in Chicago, and happy to answer any questions you got. I'll put this back up.
Thanks, Dwayne. So I guess it's great talk, lots of things to think about. And, one of the things that I encounter a lot with my customers is, I guess where it's always going to be more difficult with scale, right? If you have a newer organization that's maybe it's just a small team and that's the whole org, they're probably a lot faster to be able to make these implementations. But a bigger team, you talk about getting everybody on the same page. I know customers who one developer team uses one pipeline and tools for that pipeline, and another developer team uses a completely different set of tools for different, and there's just friction between the two, and there's difficulties there. But if we're looking here, it's starting with Git, and because the data's there with Git, at least for the first 2, and then we have to define the others. What would you say is or is there analysis done by DORA saying, hey, this is the low hanging fruit, or not even, maybe not even the low hanging fruit, but this is like, you're going to get your most value for looking into this area first.
Mhm.
And is there anything like that, or is there anything you
Yeah,
can add to that?
the Accelerate book does touch on that somewhat. Unfortunately, there's no one true path here. There's just 4 overarching metrics that show up and every elite customer that they can identify, and they ranged all over the map too, and they make a big point of that in the book. There are brand new smaller companies that are doing it completely wrong and are disintegrating under themselves, and then there's giant organizations that you wouldn't expect that are doing it great. One of the reasons I list GitLab in here and their docs, their API docs, which might seem really weird on the surface that I've included that one, but that is a language we can all get behind of like, all right, this is how an API that measures this stuff works. Maybe there is like a science we can all kind of agree here. But you ask a lot in there. Getting alignment and communication is just fundamentally hard, especially in organizations that are large enough to have multiple teams that have all bought into different tools. And that's where the top-down alignment really, really comes in handy, or not handy, becomes mandatory. If you have walls between organizations internally, and everybody's like, no, I got to do it my way. No, I got to do it my way. And everybody's buying the same general kind of tools, then you have no shared knowledge. You can't improve the org because, well, we're using 30 different things that do 5 things across the business. Is there a good fix to that? I really don't know. I'd hope there would be at some point some agreement where upper C-level management is like, look, this can't continue. Like, we have to be one team. We have one goal. I know Google does a billion things, but like the Google.com team, like that makes search, is one team with trunk-based deployment that does one thing exceptionally well inside of a much, much, much larger org that does a million things. But they, as an org that big, still consolidate as much as they can. I've known a number of employees at Google over the years who are like, no, this is not the Google way. It's just, this is the agreement because this, at the end of the day, we're serving customers to do X. And we can get there faster with better results if we collectively use this knowledge base we have and communicate along these general pathways. I think metrics come into the picture to help those conversations move along. If you can go to your immediate boss or director level, VP level, and like, hey, did you know this is the situation? Do you know that it takes us on average 2 weeks to deploy something? And it's all over the map, like where that average comes from. Like, this thing took us 2 months. This thing took us a year. This thing took us 20 minutes. There's no consistency here. And start having that conversation. And if the answer is like, we don't care, just get your job done, that's an organizational problem. I'm not sure what the answer is to that.
Right.
If there could be the answer like, I didn't know that, or hey, I was just thinking about this myself. Have you looked at this data yet? And you can start having those conversations. It's going to be organizational dependent. But if there's no one at the bottom cares that we need to fix this, and I just want to clock in, pump out my code, or do my tests and go home. Well, at the top is like, well, we need to align and delight our customers. Then that's a mismatch unto itself. That, again, I don't know how to fix that directly.
Right. Yeah, but I mean, to your point earlier, if you have that data, you can bring it and say, okay, well, we're going to implement X, Y, just like we would with code, right? Like, I have a problem, I have a bug. I'm going to try something new. I'm going to see if it fixes the thing, and I'm going to close the bug. Same thing. Like, I have this data. I see it takes me an average of 3 weeks to push something or 4 weeks to push something. I'm going to make these changes. Let's see if we can drill it down to 2 weeks, or even just minus 1 week off of it. And if we're going in the right direction. If it starts oscillating and going off the map, well, let's go back to what we were originally doing and try something else, right? But you can't do that if you can't see that. So,
if you don't, I don't want to be prescriptive and say there's one thing to look at here, but it's true though that if you are using Git, the one thing you definitely have a history of or access to is your Git history. Looking at that and saying, all right, between tags, how many commits do I have? And just start there. And if it looks pretty average, it's never going to be exactly the same every time, but it's like, hey, wait a minute, why did this tag take us, or this release have 40 different commits in it, and the next one only had 5, but it wasn't just a bug fix? Like, what happened here?
Right.
How did we get there? Start there and start asking questions out from the one thing you have that you know is true. And the conversation can go a million ways, but you'll have that one true thing at the center of it to hold you down. I think part of how we got to multiple teams using multiple tools is you have a champion on each team. Like, this is what I think the problem is, and this is how I think we solve it, and this tool does what I think will solve it. But that's based on feeling and how it directly affected their position, not the overall org and the overall org's mission. Not to say anyone's greedy in that. Again, they're trying to do what they think will solve the problem, but from their seat and not from a data-driven perspective. But that's an opinion. I don't have any actual facts or truth to say this is why that's broken. It's just from a lot of conversations I've had about this over the last year of my life.
And I think if you have a leaner team, it's a priority issue. Optimizing the process is lower on the priority than getting things out because you need to get it out because you need to hit a deadline. Obviously, if you optimize the process, that would help you get it out faster. But that also takes people's time to dig into all of those details, those nuances that are in the data and the patterns that are there that maybe they just don't have the time for because they gotta get the next release out, right? So
that's ultimately, we're in a perfect world, we would all be able to step back and say, we're going to fix this and we're going to get on the same page, but we all have the deadlines. Looking at the metrics from the lens of how does this help us with the deadlines might be a good way to approach it. Like, look, we are all super stressed. It's what was her name? Someone gave a talk about this at GitCon last year. Leslie Chapman from Comcast. She noticed that they're just looking at, this has nothing to do with DORA or any of these metrics here. This is simply a Git metric thing. At Comcast, they realized that working in 2-week cycles, the amount of time it took them to review PRs went from like 2 days to 20 minutes the closer they got to that release cycle. I'm kind of exaggerating, but I think it might have been like an hour, but it shrunk dramatically. And their change failure rate, she didn't use the exact term, but that's what she was implying, was all over the map. They lucked out and those changes that barely got QA'd worked. And sometimes they blew things up. And then they had 2 different teams that were doing the same thing, but in entirely different ways. And it wasn't until they took the Git metrics, like, look, here's on the table, why is it like this? And started interviewing people inside Comcast, say like, well, why? And the answers were shocking and revealing. It's like, well, we're working against this deadline. Like, we gotta get this code out. Doesn't matter if it worked or not. We got a deadline to hit. And then they started fixing that. I'm like, well, no, we're gonna do proper reviews for the full time it takes to do that review, and let's not worry about the deadline and not worry about we have to ship every 2 weeks. And that's then starting to look at what we do with those requests and like, why are we jamming all of this in 2 weeks? And then she gave that whole talk. You can go find that on the gitcon.com/gitcon. I don't know, gitkraken.com/gitcon. And look for Leslie Chapman. And there's a pretty good talk about that.
Yeah, we'll throw that in with these links into the show notes. We are up on our time, and I don't see any other questions at the moment. So with that, Dwayne, if you're okay, we'll call it to a close. And thank you so much again. Very, very interesting talk. You gave me lots to think about for my customers and also with my organization. Very interesting. It's like the data is always there, but sometimes it's you can't see it, because it's just, you got all these other things happening, and then it's like, well, wait, it's right there. If I just take a pause and I actually focus on this, maybe I can find some optimizations. So it's very interesting. Yeah.
And ideally, customers love data. Ideally, like, well, I look up this data that proves I'm serving you.
Right.
I don't know. Again, this is a set of opinions that hopefully push in the right direction for food for thought, and you can crap your own dang conclusions out there. But read the Accelerate book. If you take nothing else away, go buy it, read it. It's a really good book.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to go pick up a copy. Thanks so much, Dwayne. Thank you to all our viewers, and we will see you next week. Take care.
Cheers.